Chris, I think your mic is not working. Why is it not working?
Good morning, folks, and welcome to this webinar sponsored by GW Law School. This webinar is on a tumultuous year for trade and procurement. This year has seen a number of developments during the pandemic involving trade. They have involved developments both with regards to China and the European Union. With regards to China, we've seen new trade restraints being raised by the United States based on cybersecurity concerns. And with regards to procurement, we're going to be discussing those in some detail today. We've also seen new restraints with regards to the European Union, possible new constraints that we'll be talking about that can have a significant impact on both trade between the European Union and trade between the United States and the European Union. We've also seen developments in the US campaigns, the unfolding campaigns for the elections that will occur in early November here in the United States with regards to both the Biden campaign and the Trump campaign. And we'll be covering those today. Again, thank you very much for joining us. Just a quick run through of the agenda for today. I'm first going to do introductions of our guests, and thank you again to them for joining us. We're going to have presentations by our guests, and then we'll have a question and answer session. Now, during the course of the session, please feel free to ask questions in the chat room. If you could avoid the regular Q&A, there's a Q&A function in Zoom that is more difficult to use. The chat function is easier to use, and our panelists will be monitoring the chat function as well. So if you could use the chat function instead of the Q&A function, that'll be great. We're going to go for about an hour, and then we're going to take a 5-minute break. We're going to leave the session running, but we're going to turn the recording off. And at the conclusion of that 5-minute break, we're going to come back and we're going to focus on one particular topic that Scott Scheffler will be touching on this morning, Section 889 of the National Defense Authorization Act of a couple of years ago. The Section 889 is the Huawei ban, and we received a lot of questions about the Huawei ban. So we're going to have a special session afterwards, not being recorded, but a special session for half an hour. During that 5-minute break, if you want to join the special session as a panelist, in effect turning it from a webinar into a meeting, just send me a note in the chat session and I'll go ahead and promote you to the panel, because it'll be an open discussion during that half hour, again, to discuss the special issues under the Huawei ban, which is a major compliance burden being faced in the US contracting community right now. There are a lot of practical issues that have to be addressed under Section 889, and so we'll be discussing those in the special follow-up session after that 5-minute break. But again, in the first sessions, we're going to try to conclude in about 60 minutes. We're going to try to conclude in about an hour. So just to introduce our panelists, Laurence Folio-Lalio is joining us from the University of Paris-Nanterre. She commutes back and forth to Senegal, and we're very happy to have her. She and I recently co-published a piece in Concurrences, which is an antitrust journal, and that piece should go up on the Social Science Research Network today or tomorrow. She'll be talking about that piece and some of the issues we've raised regarding protectionism and procurement. We're also joined by Scott Scheffler, who is, Scott Scheffler, who is a partner at Felsman Tucker. He's going to be talking about Section 889. Scott is a former student in our program, and he is one of the experts in the procurement community on the bridge between grants and procurement. He's one of the few people who works in both domains. So we'll also be asking Scott to talk about the impact of Section 889, the Huawei ban, on the grants community. In the US federal system, about $600 billion goes to grants, about $500 billion goes to procurement. So the grants element of the 889 ban is also very, very relevant. Tom McSorley is joining us from Arnold & Porter. He's a senior associate there. He specializes in issues of export control. He'll be talking about the CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification that's being implemented by the Defense Department. The CMMC, like Section 889, can raise a lot of barriers to foreigners who want to enter the US markets. It's a very important development, also a major compliance burden potentially for those in the US procurement market. Jean Howman-Greer will be joining us from JAGE. She is a former lead on procurement issues for the U.S. Trade Representative. She's known around the world as a very effective negotiator on procurement issues. She was instrumental in putting together many of the free trade agreements involving the United States that have procurement elements to them. And she is the foremost U.S. authority on the U.S. coverage issues regarding the GPA, the Government Procurement Agreement. She'll be talking about the GPA. She'll be joined by Robert Anderson, who was the lead at the WTO Secretariat, the World Trade Organization Secretariat on GPA issues. Rob recently published a piece on the GPA and its applicability to procurement during the pandemic. That piece, and the other resources produced by Jean Greer, by Laurence Folio-Lalliot and myself, the background materials are all included on publicprocurementinternational.com on the information page for this event. We're also joined by Professor Michał Kaniap. Michał was a Fulbright scholar with us at GW for a year. We were delighted to have him there. He's from the University of Silesia in southwestern Poland. He regularly does programs with us that are programs that span between Europe and the United States. So as we exchange ideas between our two systems. Michał will be talking about some of the initiatives in the European Union to assess possible subsidies in procurement and the effect that could have on trade between the United States and Europe and between Europe and other trading partners around the world. Finally, Roland Stein, who is a named partner at Blumstein. It's a firm his is a firm in Berlin that focuses on public procurement issues, both on the civil side and on the defense side. Roland will be talking with us also about the European protectionism and some of the other initiatives that are emerging in the European Union, including a very important recent decision in a regional court in Brandenburg regarding an explicit exclusion of a Chinese vendor based on Chinese content in the proffer from that Chinese tender. A very important development in terms of potential protections and potential bars to entry in the European public procurement markets. So thank you very much to our guests for joining us. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laurence. Laurence, welcome.
Thank you, Chris. I would like to briefly introduce the analysis developed in our article published on September 1st in Concurrence, which means competition, but the article is in English anyway. And we highlight the disruptive effects of the COVID crisis and the shocks undergone by the fundamental pillars of international public procurement. First, what we call the temporal disruption, with the forced acceleration of emergency procedures. Second, the competition disruption, which caused inversion of the public purchasing market. It was a vendors-driven market. And third, the epistemological disruption, which means the destruction of assumptions grounded in a monopolistic market with competition among buyers. And lastly, the geographic disruption due to the global dimension of the public demand. And so the disruption of the worldwide supply chains. So finally, it raised the protectionist issue. It used to be a peripheral and viewed as a political issue, but now it becomes central because it seems to be an answer to all the issues I just mentioned. Protectionism in buying and protectionism in producing, because we also see a lot of restriction around the export markets. And I think all these issues will be now covered by our presenter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurence. Scott, can I turn it over to you to discuss the Huawei ban in Section 889?
Certainly, and thank you. In the time we have on the webinar, what I'll try to do is just provide a high-level framework so that those who are interested have sort of a skeleton that as they do their own research can put some meat on the bone. And certainly happy to stay after, as you mentioned, and talk in greater detail on specific issues and have a discussion. So we call this, or I call this at least, the Huawei ban because it resonates in a way that those who hear it get a sense of what this restriction is all about. But certainly Section 889 has some very important definitional aspects that are not on the slide, but I want to highlight, which is what is the stuff that the Huawei ban bans. So what I'd like to do is start by talking briefly through this sort of offending equipment, if you will, and then we'll talk about the restrictions within the system very briefly, and then I'll turn it over and we can talk in depth as we meet after. So the key, as you see in the slide here, but the key language or the key prohibitions relate to quote unquote covered telecommunications equipment or services. And really, if you wanted to read it more sort of specifically, it's any equipment, system, or service that uses covered telecommunications equipment or services as a substantial component. It actually says substantial, essential, or essential component of any system. But when you look at the definition of substantial component, as we get into this, what we're talking about is a component that makes the system function as intended. So in IT, this is a fairly low bar in my view. So what's the covered telecommunications equipment or services that we're dealing with here? It's defined in the statute, and most of the guidance, including the FAR clause, really just reiterates the statute. But what we're talking about is telecommunications equipment or services, in particular equipment received from Huawei Telecommunications Company, ZTE Corporation, or any of their subsidiaries or affiliates. And that's sort of writ large. And there are a large number of subsidiaries and affiliates. The Commerce Department, in fact, listed 115 affiliates, I think it was, of Huawei. And I saw an article that mentioned that Huawei Technologies Corporation holds over 87,000 US patents. So we're talking about a lot of stuff. And then in terms of when equipment is used for security purposes, whether it's government, it's any public security purpose, which will matter in a second when we talk about the federal grant system a little bit. But when the stuff is used for security purposes, whether IT security or physical security, including security cameras, surveillance equipment, the ban is broader. Covered telecommunications equipment also includes equipment from Dahua, from Hikvision, and from, I always have to look back at the list, Hytera Communications Corporation. So it is other entities of the People's Republic of China as well. This is focused at companies that are heavily influenced or controlled by the government of the People's Republic of China. When it comes to the restrictions, we have the A1a and the A1b restriction that everyone has been talking about, and then we also have the subparagraph B restriction. So what the A1a restriction came out last year for most entities, and the idea was you couldn't sell covered telecommunications equipment to the federal government. And so to the extent that you were providing IT services, IT equipment to the federal government, you had to submit a representation that in fact did include this stuff. And that you would report, if you found later that it included this stuff, you would report that promptly within one business day to the federal government. That restriction has now been flowed down through the federal grant system, the federal financial assistance system, as of this past August 13th, to everyone who uses federal dollars that they received through a federal grant when they're buying stuff. So we're talking about every state and local government. We're talking about a large number of nonprofits, especially in the healthcare industry, are now operating as mini federal agencies with respect to this cannot procure or obtain restriction. And then, and to give you a sense, many states and local governments, just to highlight this grants piece, 20 to 30% of their budget is actually federal dollars. So federal funds influencing state and local procurements can have a very, very significant impact. You may be thinking, well, I actually know about the grant system, and I know that generally speaking, states don't have to follow these federal procurement rules. This particular rule has been implemented in such a way that it will apply to state governments as well. So this is a fairly broad, the A1a restriction is fairly broad, and it really is implemented through those two pieces. The representation, you're not providing this stuff to the entity that's buying, and then that follow-up obligation in the contract to report if you discover that in fact you were wrong. Then A1b has actually been the piece that's really caused more of the stir. And as of theoretically August 13th, though in DOD, there's been a delayed implementation to September 30th. And that is, again, that's a DOD delayed implementation. In any event, for example, HHS, I saw a contract solicitation yesterday that included these terms, but the restriction is broader. It's that government agencies cannot even contract with or extend contracts with entities that use covered telecommunications or equipment or services as a substantial component of the sort of equipment or services that they're consuming. So this restriction, the question has become, how do we know? The guidance from the federal government on this, and in fact, in the FAR clause, the certification is that you've made a reasonable inquiry. The Federal Register notice that has promulgated this rule has indicated you don't need to use outside audit services to determine whether or not you're using this equipment. This is an area of considerable ambiguity, however, because a lot of entities, certainly non-IT providers, non-major sort of defense contractor type entities, are going to struggle to identify whether they're even using Huawei technology, ZTE Corporation technology in their day-to-day activities. So this is a significant area of ambiguity. To that end, another sort of important question becomes, well, how will the federal government enforce this? And I think it's fair to say we're yet to see. Certainly we know that they will not be extending contracts if you're certifying that in fact you are using this technology, right? They're prohibited from doing so. So that means a relatively rapid review of our systems. Our clients are going to have to do a relatively rapid review of their systems at some level to make that reasonable certification. And in terms of enforcement, prior to that moment, I think we have a little bit of time to ramp up. It depends on when your contracts come due for that option to be exercised, or if you're competing for a new contract now. On the A1a side, if this is equipment or services that you're actually furnishing to the federal government, I tend to expect that enforcement will take the form of, okay, you've identified that you're providing us with a non-conforming end product. We expect you to take action to make that end product conform, and expect you to do that at your own expense. But again, I think time will tell. On both fronts, I think an important question, from a contract management standpoint is this a change to my contract that's presently compensable? I now have a new term that requires me to take significant compliance steps that will be very costly. And it's my view that in fact it likely is a compensable contract change. I don't think the fact that it's implemented through your option, the exercise of the option changes that. And there may be arguments about whether or not this is a sovereign act. I tend to think since it's implemented specifically through contracts, it won't be viewed as a sovereign act. So contractors should be thinking very hard about whether or not they want to file requests for equitable adjustments or contract claims when this mod is made on their contracts. And you can expect that will be coming. The last piece is compliance is likely to be a lot harder for, and sort of very relevant to this particular panel, entities that operate overseas or have significant operations overseas. I think it's safe to say that even in a year, it will be harder overseas because the US market will respond to these requirements, especially since they're flowed down to state and local governments. And we'll be able to identify in our supply chains what the offending technology is, and we'll have alternative options. That may not be the case overseas. So with that, I'll turn it back, and I'm happy to stay after and answer specific questions.
Thanks very much, Scott. I'm going to turn it over now to Tom to talk about the CMMC.
Thanks, Chris. So yeah, to pile on here and discuss other aspects of U.S. government contracting that are changing and maybe of a particular burden to contractors operating outside the U.S. The Department of Defense. So now, Scott was just talking about a rule that affects all federal contractors and grantees, as he said. This rule, for now, affects only Department of Defense contractors, which is obviously a huge market, but is not everyone who does business with the federal government. Although I think in the long run, these kinds of rules will be extended to federal contractors outside the defense space. But just over the past year, the Department of Defense has significantly increased what their cybersecurity requirements are going to be on any companies that contract with the Department of Defense and their supply chain. So again, unlike the 889 rule, where some aspects of that rule that are more onerous don't flow down, this rule, the cybersecurity rules, are supposed to, in general, flow down throughout the supply chain. And so this will have a big follow-on effect in the market. So what are we talking about here? Beginning in about 2013, the Department of Defense implemented a proto rule to where we are now that imposed cybersecurity requirements on contractors where they are handling DoD data, but also where they are handling their own data that they use in support of DoD contracts. And that's, in my view, a subset of the data that kind of swallows the rule. So this is not only about contractors protecting DoD data, which seems fair enough, but it's also about contractors protecting the data that they're using specifically in support of the DoD contracts. And there are ways to interpret that line, but that's an issue that affects a lot of companies. So about 7 years ago, DoD first imposed this rule. Over time, they've continued to expand and refine the rule. But throughout that process, the rule has imposed the standard. It's a US government standard. It's not an international standard on contractors doing business with DoD. And it contains a set of controls that contractors are supposed to follow to demonstrate that they have sufficient cybersecurity in place to handle DoD data. The big change over the past year, and the one that we think is going to have a big impact on the entire defense industrial base, is that for the first time, they are moving from a self-certification process where contractors were able to look at the standards that were being imposed and then determine in their own view that they were meeting the standard and basically sign a certification and submit that they're in ongoing compliance with these cyber rules. Starting soon, it's been delayed because of COVID-19. It was supposed to start rolling out in June, but this is now a longer term process. Contractors working with DoD are going to have to get certified by a third party, and what they're calling here a CMMC third-party assessment organization, or a C3PAO, if you see what they did there. What does this mean? Well, first of all, why is this happening? It's happening because obviously, like everyone around the world, and you see this echoes of this in the 889 ban, the US government and obviously commercial entities and governments around the world are very concerned about cybersecurity, counterintelligence, protection of IP, protection of government data. And there's a sense in the government that relying on contractors to self-certify has been insufficient. And so they want third-party validation that the companies the DoD is doing business with do have sufficient cyber practices. However, this is not solely a product of the government being paranoid about the level of compliance within the contracting community. It's also about contractors concerned about their own compliance risks, because self-certification has been helpful in many ways because it allows companies to look at the standards, to interpret them, and to have some flexibility in deciding that they're meeting the spirit of the standards. And DoD has actually encouraged companies to be flexible in how they're viewing the standards. At the same time, if it turns out your standards are not sufficient because you do have a breach, which you have to report to the government under another rule, then you know what's going to happen is the government comes in, they look at your compliance, they look at your practices, and there's a high risk that they determine your self-certification was wrong, right? And there's the factual problem is that the people who are, or the contractors that are going to be singled out for this kind of criticism are the contractors that have a breach. So you're in a risky compliance environment where you have a lot of flexibility right now to self-certify. But if it turns out there is a breach, suddenly everyone's going to be questioning your self-certification. And in the United States, there's a significant risk of liability, both not only breach of contract liability, but also False Claims Act liability, where whistleblowers can come after you for triple damages if it turns out you falsely certified material terms to the government. So the bottom line is that this is a result, this new third-party certification model is a result both of the government wanting to be more sure about contractor compliance and their supply chain, but also contractors wanting to be sure that when they sign a certification, they have now something behind it, a third party saying, indeed, you are compliant, and so that should help mitigate the risk that someone can question the certification later. So finally, what does this mean in terms of the international community? The problem obviously is that when you move from a flexible standard where you can take your practices, your commercial practices, and adjust them and look at them and think about them in terms of the government standard, now soon you're going to have to convince a third-party auditor that is, hired by the government, certified by the government, thinking like the government, to agree with your interpretation of your practices and the fact that they meet the government standard. And so what's likely going to happen is that the contracting community and the supply chain are going to be more constrained in what they can do, and that's going to raise costs and also limit entry into for now, the defense contracting base. So we'll see where this goes. It's delayed. There's still a lot to be done, but it's certainly going to be in the long run a sort of a new gating entry to be a government contractor with the Department of Defense.
Thanks very much, Tom. Tom, I know you'll have to leave, so I wanted to ask you a question now. What practical advice would you provide to a company that's considering entering the Defense Department marketplace, either domestic company or foreign company? How should they address this potential compliance risk?
Yeah, so if you have not been dealing with these standards at all, the first thing you can do is go to, just Googled CMMC, and you'll get to the DoD. Go to the government website, there's a lot of blog posts, but it should be one of the top hits. And there you'll see the framework is up there in terms of what the standards are that are relevant. The main one is NIST 800-171, which is National Institute of Standards and Technology. 800-171 is the main standard, but there are others. It's sort of a gradient depending on how risky your contract is. But you can look at those standards, they're published standards. And there are also resources online that crosswalk those standards to standards that, commercial entities are familiar with that haven't been involved in government contracting, such as ISO 27001. So what I would recommend if you're considering getting into the defense contracting business in the United States is to look at those standards, have your IT team, your chief information security officer, look at those standards and begin thinking early on about whether your security practices are compatible, or maybe how they're compatible with the standards being imposed by the government, and then start to think about where changes might need to be made to convince a third-party auditor. And we don't have guidance yet on what the audits will look like, but how a third-party auditor would assess your current practices against what the government standards say. So I would say that's the place to start.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'll turn it over to Jean. Jean, you're on mute. My sin as well.
Okay, there we go. I'm going to talk about Buy America in the time of a pandemic. The need of countries across the world to acquire personal protective equipment, PPEs, masks, and other products to fight COVID-19 has shined a spotlight on government procurement. And every country wants to ensure that it is able to buy all the products that it needs to protect its citizens. Promises to buy only domestic products can sound patriotic, regardless how short-sighted or unrealistic they may be. The US has a long history of imposing Buy American requirements on government procurement. US trade agreements with procurement commitments exclude a wide array of procurement that is subject to various domestic purchasing requirements that the US cannot waive. The only law that the US waives in its trade agreements is the Buy American Act. We also have a very active Congress with regard to Buy American legislation. And virtually every session of Congress, it considers new Buy American legislation. And from the beginning of his presidency, President Trump has vigorously pursued Buy American policies. In August, he issued a long-promised executive order on ensuring essential medicines are made in the US. That order requires the Food and Drug Administration within 90 days of the order to identify essential medicines, countermeasures such as PPEs, and critical inputs that are medically necessary to be available at all times. And once the FDA has produced that list, federal agencies must purchase products on the list from domestic sources by limiting competition to US-made products and dividing a procurement between 2 or more US manufacturers. The order also extends the Buy American requirements to the Department of Defense's reciprocal defense procurement agreements. Industry groups, lawmakers, and others had repeatedly advised the administration against issuing such an order, contending that closing off access to foreign suppliers could create supply chain vulnerabilities, and pointing out also that the US capacity is often not sufficient to meet immediate public health needs. And they pointed, for example, that 72% of pharmaceutical ingredients are manufactured outside the US. In April of this year, the Trump administration had to reckon with insufficient supplies of PPEs, N95 masks, and other products to fight the COVID crisis. They had insufficient supplies from US sources and trade agreement partners. So the General Services Administration issued a non-availability determination that allowed the government to lift temporarily a procurement ban on purchasing these products from China and other countries that have not opened their procurement to the US. In the Congress, there are various legislative proposals that would require agencies to purchase US-made PPEs. The US-made Act of 2020 would require PPE and other related products to be acquired from domestic producers for the strategic national stockpile. Another measure would require agencies to issue long-term contracts for American-made PPEs in order to strengthen the onshore production. If former Vice President Biden is elected president in November, Buy American policies could be expected to continue. In a Buy American plan that he put out a few weeks ago, he indicated that he wants to tighten domestic content requirements and waivers of those requirements, and to extend Buy American requirements beyond projects funded by the Department of Transportation to other forms of governmental assistance. There's no detail in this plan, but it does indicate that he will continue the Buy American policies of the president. But he also calls for working with trading partners to modernize international rules and to quote, make sure that the US and allies can use their own taxpayer dollars to spur investment in their own countries. Now that has echoes of the stimulus package that was passed by Congress at the beginning of the Obama administration. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act required states and local governments to use US-produced iron, steel, and manufactured products in infrastructure projects funded by the legislation. It ensured compliance with US trade obligations by excluding foreign products that were covered by those agreements. Now, the US is a party to the WTO Government Procurement Agreement, the GPA, a plurilateral agreement that covers 47 other WTO members, as well as free trade agreements with a wide variety of countries. Now, a fundamental obligation of those agreements is to not discriminate against goods from other parties. The US includes PPEs, masks, and other products used to fight COVID-19 in the procurement that it brings under those agreements. So subjecting them to any new Buy American requirements would be contrary to the agreements. To remain compliant with the agreements, the US could remove those products from the agreements, as the president has mandated for essential medicines, or invoke an exception for procurement related to human health and safety under the GPA and FTAs. And Rob Anderson will discuss this exception shortly. Under the Buy American Essential Medicines Order, the president directed the US trade representative to take steps to remove the products from the GPA and FTAs. But that's not a unilateral process. It requires notification of proposed changes. GPA parties have 45 days to object to the removal. If they object, which many would be likely to do, any consultations that were not able to resolve the objections would allow the US to just pull the products off the list, off its commitments, but not for 108, not for 5 months after its initial notice. So this is not a quick process. But more importantly, in such a case, if the US pulled products off the list, other countries could retaliate by withdrawing substantially equivalent coverage from the US. Removing essential medicines from trade obligations could set a precedent for other products that the US wants to produce and buy domestically. If other, if other countries withdraw comparable procurement, it could lead to an erosion of procurement covered by trade agreements and decrease the value of those procurements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gene. I'm going to turn it over to Rob, and we'll have some follow-up questions for you both afterwards.
Well, warm thanks to Jean for her very clear and well-informed explanation of the recent executive order on essential medicines and related developments that are underway. I would have to agree that the trends that we see are concerning. We also need to see them in context. They are coming in the lead up to a tightly contested national election in the US, and on the heels of the US administration's announced intention to withdraw from the World Health Organization a month or so ago. And its even more recent announcement, just I think yesterday or the day before, that the US will not join in an international effort involving 170 countries to work together to speed vaccine development and to ensure that all participating governments will receive equitable shares of the doses as they become available. So this seems to reflect a view that the US on its own can win the race, as it were, to an effective vaccine. I just want to point out that this is a high-risk strategy. It eliminates the chance to secure in advance doses from a pool of promising vaccine candidates that are being developed and investigated in many other countries now. And more generally, and as Jean indicated, if the executive order on essential medicines is implemented as it has been issued, it will represent a significant step toward erosion of the legal basis for international trade in public procurement, not only with respect to drugs and medicines and vaccines that are needed to fight COVID-19, but also of drugs, medicines, vaccines that will be needed to fight future pandemics and other medical emergencies. And, you know, we don't really know what shape those future medical emergencies will have. So it's kind of difficult to guess in advance and be confident that your own suppliers, domestic suppliers, will be able to produce in advance what is needed. Now, the Biden approach, I would say, also goes a bit in this direction, but a good deal more cautiously. As Jean has underlined, it would be implemented in cooperation with US trade partners and, it would seem, in compliance with agreed international rules. And I think this is rather an important distinction. So why should we be concerned about these directions and these developments? Well, I offhand would cite three reasons. One is that viruses and bacteria do not respect international borders. And it's really short-sighted to think that here on our planet with its 7.8 billion people, we will be safe in the United States if countries around us are being devoured by the pandemic. And this is really why the US, why for decades, the United States and other countries have supported international efforts to eradicate dangerous illnesses and address public health threats. We can all be safer together. I would also make the point that the international agreements that are at stake are, by and large, are good agreements. And the GPA in particular was renegotiated and modernized in 2012 with very significant leadership from the United States, in addition to the European Union, Canada, Japan, and other traditional US allies. It is the gold standard internationally for best practices in public procurement to ensure transparency, competition, integrity, and best value for money. And the agreement is actually currently attracting very positive attention internationally. For example, Brazil, very important world economy, and other emerging economies are in the process of joining the GPA. This, I suggest, is very much in the interest of the US and other participating countries' exporters. And emphatically, I would make the point that the GPA does not stand in the way of appropriate emergency measures in the context of COVID-19. And in particular, and Chris mentioned my article on this point with Anna Mueller, which is posted on his website. In particular, the GPA authorizes the use of expedited procurement procedures, shorter time periods in circumstances of urgency, permits governments to implement limited tendering or direct award procedures in circumstances of extreme urgency, and it contains a broadly worded and important exception for any measures that are necessary for the protection of human life or health. This means that in the limit, participating countries can throw out the rule book if they have to cope with a public health emergency. So, and I'm coming to the end. For resilience, our economies and our supply chains need the diversity of supply possibilities that participating in a global procurement market can bring. And excluding foreign suppliers will certainly raise prices and costs. It will facilitate supplier collusion and monopolistic abuse. I think there's some evidence of this in the paper by Chris and Laurence Folio. And it will create bottlenecks and shortages when new pandemics or other crises come along. So none of this is to say that the system is perfect. There is, in fact, a lacuna in the WTO system with respect to export restraints. And there is international interest in fixing this. And there are efforts underway to look at solutions led by, for example, one particular initiative is led by New Zealand and Singapore to establish greater transparency and for participating countries to commit to not adopt export restraints. So all these possibilities are there, and this very important work is going on internationally. What troubles me is that the United States is no longer at the center of these efforts, as it was for most of my working lifetime and all of my 22 years in the WTO. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob. That was excellent. So I'll turn over to Kalkania.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you for having me here. I really appreciate this occasion. I'm here to talk about white paper consulting on leveling the playing field as regards foreign subsidies. This white paper has been issued by the European Commission, one of the EU bodies, on 17 June 2020. This communication results from two documents. The first one is the guidance on the participation of third countries bidders in the EU procurement market from 2019. And the second one, very important one for Europe, is a new industrial strategy for Europe of 10 March 2020. This document creates several aims, including support of green technology, digitalization, and further support of internal market. White paper proposes the creation of new geostrategic instrument, which basic and simple aim is just to protect EU companies against unfair advantage from companies benefiting from subsidies from non-EU states. It is also worth to mention that the COVID-19 pandemic has made European companies more receptive to competition during public procurement procedure by subsidized foreign products. But the practical and more sophisticated question is which companies could and would be mostly affected by the actions foreseen in the white paper. So 2 points I would like to mention. The first one, 2 weeks ago, Fortune magazine published the first 500 global companies. Under Mr. President Xi Jinping, 124 are Chinese companies. And what is the most important thing, due to CSIS report, 91 of them are SOEs, so it means state-owned enterprises. So it makes a red flag concerning state aid. In Beijing, there are 48 central COEs directly under the authority of the national government, either the State-Owned Asset Supervision and Administration Commission or the Ministry of Finance. By the way, there are 121 US companies and less than 100 EU companies, mostly owned by private equity. The second point is directions of infrastructure development, and thus, in my opinion, the direction of public procurement development as a tool for achieving these goals. So due to the new European industry strategy, two main goals are very important. Green technology, we've got the new Green European Deal, and the digitalization aspects. Particularly digitalization, in my opinion, is very important because this is connected with the fourth industrial revolution, 5G implementation, what we've got now, a blockchain for Europe, And all of this potential leads to the creation and development of smart cities issues. And in this field, we observe a huge development of Chinese companies, mostly with the Shenzhen region companies, which has been already adopted in many African and South Asia countries. And there are big expectations related to market expansion in Europe. The white paper sets out 3 modules. The most important for us is the module 3, which concerns distortions caused by foreign subsidies in the context of procurement procedures. So we are talking about a market of 250,000 public authorities, which is worth 2 trillion euro. It's 14% of GDP, which some 352 billion has been opened for public procurement of goods, services, and works markets to bidders from GPA signatories. So the assumption of the white paper is again that the foreign companies may win contracts through procurement procedures by outbidding European rivals. Just a few words about the EU single market. So this is one of the biggest achievements of the public procurement in the EU single market, which rely on free market, free and fair competition, and linked with this rule state aid restrictions. State aid definition, which gave the pattern for foreign subsidy, definition in the white paper. White paper refers to a financial contribution by a government or any public of a non-EU state, which confers a benefit to a recipient and which is limited in law or in fact to an individual undertaking or industry or to a group of undertakings or industries. So far, EU public procurement directives do not lay down specific rules regarding bidders benefiting from foreign subsidies. We've got Article 69 of the Directive 2014/24 on public procurement, which allows procuring authorities to reject abnormally low tenders due to state aid, but it applies to subsidies granted by EU member states, but not to foreign subsidies, in fact, which do not fall within the scope of Article 107 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. So what we've got in practice, public buyers lack the necessary resources to investigate whether bidders benefit from foreign subsidies or to assess the extent to which subsidies might cause distortion in procurement markets. Just short information briefly about the procedure. So white paper foresees the procedure in which companies participating in public procurement procedure would have to notify to the contracting authority when submitting their bid whether they or any of their consortium members of subcontractors have received relevant financial contributions within the last 3 years preceding the participation in the procedure. So we've got also the self-assessment as self-certification, which carries significant risk of error and circumvention. And those third parties and competitors could inform the contracting authority that a notification should have been made, which will result as an evidence for the necessity for the notification. The notification should be submitted then to the contracting authority, which shall further transmitted to the component supervisory authority, so it's very complicated, to proceed with the investigation on the information and assess the existence of a foreign subsidy. The investigation will be divided into 2 steps, preliminary review and in-depth investigation. If the supervisory authorities concludes in first step, in first phase, that no foreign subsidy exists, it informs the contracting authority. If there are doubts, the other phase will be initiating. In this phase, supervisory can decide that a foreign subsidy exists or that it doesn't exist. Either way, it has to inform the European Commission. So there is a close cooperation between national and European Commission authority of its intended decision before informing the contracting authority. The white paper provides that in case the supervisory authority in its review confirms that the economic operator has received a foreign subsidy, the contracting authority would determine whether the subsidy has distorted the public procurement procedure. And if a foreign subsidy is found to be distorted, the firm will be excluded from the ongoing procurement procedure and could additionally be excluded for several years from future procedures before the same contract authority. Next steps and conclusions. So we've got now the public consultation, inviting comments from stakeholders, which lasts till the 23rd of December this year. Of course, multiple questions arise. I would like just to point a few of them. So the first thing is problems with the definition of subsidies in theory and practice, and the monitoring of the financial flow between market players. The second thing is connected with the limitation of the administrative burden for public buyers. So we are talking about thresholds and additional conditions. Also, compliance with GPA and FTA agreement is important. And the last thing, the scope of the future regulation. Should we concentrate only on public procurement, or should we treat it much broader and think about PPP, so public-private partnership, which is very largely used by Chinese companies also in Africa and South Asia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mikhail. It's a very complex white paper, and thank you for summarizing it so well. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I'll be touching on a similar issue. It's I think coming from the same direction as Mika was just telling us, but it's a bit older from the legislative history, and it deals with the IPI, so the International Procurement Instrument. I think Mika, because you were telling some figures, I just wanted to add two figures here. They don't relate to Chinese investments in public procurement, but to foreign direct investment, which is another area which is of great concern in the US and the EU. And I think sometimes it's good to look at what's really happening also economically. And if we look as far as I've learned, the greatest peak of Chinese FDI in the US and in the EU was in 2017. And from that moment on, it dropped 33% in Europe, and it dropped 95% in the US. So I think, just to give some flavor that, perhaps the big threat that we see is not as big in practice as we think it is when we look at the legislative papers. But, let's look into the IPI, so the International Procurement Instrument. It goes back a long way. The proposal that we're discussing now is from the year 2016, and it deals with the access of third country companies to the EU internal market. And similar to the white paper, it's all about tackling the lack of the level playing field in the world procurement market. And the IPI is intended to be a tool to encourage trading partners, to negotiate about the access to their procurement markets and ultimately open them for EU companies. So how does the system as contemplated by the European Commission work? It foresees a very strong role of the European Commission, which is to investigate alleged procurement barriers. These procurement barriers are defined very broadly as any legislative, regulatory, or administrative measure of either a government or a contracting authority that results in a serious and recurrent impairment of access of EU contractors. So that doesn't matter whether it's de jure or de facto. So any real barriers could lead to a barrier to be investigated by the European Commission. Now, if the European Commission learns of such a barrier, it will start an investigation, which can take up to 1 year. It will then, write a report, and if it finds such a barrier, it will start a consultation with that country where this barrier is coming from. Now, if everything goes right, the country will exceed EU covering government contracts. If that's not the case, the Commission will impose penalties, which are officially called price adjustment measures. These measures can be a penalty of up to 20% to be calculated on the price of the tenders concerned, meaning the tenders from companies of this country. Now, I think what's important to note is that the IPI does not apply to countries which have an agreement covering international government contracts with the EU. So, that's all GPA countries, but also, other countries that concluded one of the modern FTAs, such as Canada, Japan, Singapore. So, companies from these countries, as long as they remain in the GPA, would not have an issue with the IPI. Now, one of the issues that, I think may be a real issue is that the European business associations, which were pretty reluctant on the role of the IPI, they started changing that. And I think the change came about in 2018, 2019, when the discussions with the Chinese government on an FTA, closed, and the idea was always that we cannot close, the market to China because it's so important to European companies. And when when it became clear that it would not be an agreement, the Business Europe, one of the major associations here in Europe, it's now strongly supporting the Commission's approach for an IPI. And it's not only in favor of the 2016 draft, but it's really requesting a broadened approach to cover state-owned entities and subsidies, as Michael was just telling to us. Now, Business Europe is, while they support that, in principle, they have some issues with the technicalities, in particular regarding the rules of origin. Anyone that deals with customs law will know that rules of origin are a nightmare, and this nightmare would then be, find its way into a public procurement procedure. So it can be pretty difficult when it gets to analyzing the origin of a good, but it's really, a complete nightmare when it gets to analyzing the origin of an economic operator. We're living in an international world where you have, companies being owned by a PE, which, has its managed somewhere. So where does this company really come from? So I think the idea that Business Europe has is that a twofold. First is that if a country is known to, to have a barrier, then any SOEs and subsidized companies of this country should be directly excluded. And it foresees and it advocates for heavy penalties well above 20% on any other companies originating from this country. And this would also include subsidiaries of these countries. And I think, just on a personal note, I have no one knows what's happening in Brussels. I think not even the people in Brussels. But given the strong political support and now business support for the IPI, I think the people here expect this instrument to come into force in one form or the other, rather sooner than later. Okay, Chris, can we move on to the next slide, please? I think I just want to touch on one case. Before I do so, just a very brief reference to the EU guidance on the participation of third country bidders in the EU. Now, I'm sorry that it's a bit complicated because the EU has several parallel routes. Mikkel was speaking about one. We have the IPI, and now we also have this EU guidance. The EU guidance of July 2019 is basically just a summary of what can already be done based on the legislation as it is in force now to deal with third country bidders. And it pretty much reminds governments and contracting authorities of some tools that they already have. So, it reaffirms that companies from non-GPA countries do not have a secured access to the EU. That's more of a philosophical question because it doesn't really apply in the member states, in fact. Then goes on and reminds contracting authorities of the possibility to exclude abnormally low bids. And I think that's an important point because it leads over to our case here. It stresses the relevance in the utility sector. And in the Utilities Directive, there is a specific provision allowing the exclusion of third country bidders. And this is Article 85, which reads that any tender submitted for the award of a supply contract may be rejected where the proportion of the products originating in third countries exceeds 50% of the total value of the products constituting the tender. So it applies to supply contracts, and if the goods to be supplied are in a value with 50% or more from a country that is not a GPA country, then this bidder can be excluded in a utilities procedure. And this applied in our case here. Chris already mentioned that case. So it was a award procedure for trams in Frankfurt. So not the Western Frankfurt with the airport, but we have an Eastern Frankfurt, which is at the border with Poland. And this city wanted to acquire some trams, and it went through a public procurement and negotiation procedure. And in the procurement document, it referred to the German provision implementing section Article 85 of the Utilities Directive, which I have just cited. 3 companies were then invited to submit best and final offers, including Skoda from the Czech Republic and CRC, the big Chinese SOE in this area. Just to be here on the, so we have not advised CRC on this matter. We have advised CRC on other matters, but we have not been aware of this case until it was published. CRC, in the course of the best and final offer, declared that 70% of the goods to be delivered were of non-GPA countries, so I presume China. Following the submission of the offer, CRC's bid was excluded, but not because of the Chinese content, but rather for technical reasons. CRC challenged that, and in the subsequent challenge procedure, it was additionally excluded for the Article 85 procedure because of the Chinese content. But both the review chamber in question and also the higher court thus finally came to the conclusion that this exclusion was lawful. It stated that there is only one requirement for a company to be excluded, namely that more than 50% of the goods come from a third country. And if this requirement is met, then the company can be excluded. This is not a public procurement background to this rule, but rather a international trade law, based on the principle of reciprocity. So, there's nothing against the bidder in question, but rather, just a consequence of the principle of reciprocity. What didn't play a role, according to both courts, was that CRC was only excluded in the course of the review procedure. The court here said that there is a very wide margin of discretion, and the authority can pretty much exclude such a third country bidder at any time until the procedure is finalized. They also find no flaws in the discretion being used. The reason for that finding is that, in an internal note, the authority, stated its, I guess, real reasons to exclude the bidder, which were language barriers, which they found difficult to communicate with this bidder. But this was not an issue for the court, which said that this was just an additional argument. And the main argument here, or the only requirement, was that it was a non-GPA bidder. And if you have additional grounds, even if they for themselves would be considered to be erroneous, that's not harmful for the exclusion as such. So I think that's concludes this judgment. I think it's interesting because it's the first ever judgment of this type we've seen in Germany, and also in Europe. There's always reference made to one or other exclusions, mainly from Chinese bidders. But I think that's the first time that we have a final decision on this matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roland. Thank you for that coverage. I'm going to beg the audience's indulgence, and we'll go for an extra 10 minutes so we can talk about some of the questions that have arisen during the course of the session. So we'll close out just before 10:15. So the first question, let me skip ahead to some of the questions we framed The first section, this question goes to the 889 ban. This is for Scott. If you look at the interim rule, and the interim rule for 889 implementation is linked on the publicprocurementinternational.com website. It talks about, in broad terms, 3 different goals. The first goal in the Huawei ban is to counter Chinese government espionage against the US government itself. The second is to check Chinese theft of industrial secrets from the United States. And the third is to address or undercut Chinese economic dominance. All 3 goals appear in the interim rule. Does it depend what the goal is of this rule if you're trying to assess the materiality of a violation of the rule for purposes of the False Claims Act? Because if someone just somewhere in the supply chain has a Huawei-based device, is that a material type of violation that could trigger the liability under the False Claims Act, the treble damages that Tom referred to with regards to the CMMC?
So it's a great question. So thank you for it. I'll answer this with a somewhat cynical Washington perspective, perhaps. But I would say that under the False Claims Act, when we're looking at the question of materiality, fundamentally the question is, right under the Escobar standard, to the extent that we can divine what the Escobar standard means, the fundamental question is, would the government have paid if it knew the truth with respect to the thing that you certified or that you otherwise indicated, right, differently? So I would say that in that respect, it doesn't so much matter what the underlying purpose of the restrictions are, so much as whether the restrictions were in the contract and whether your compliance with those restrictions mattered to the government and the government's decision to pay. So along those lines, I'd say, I think it's a little early to tell the extent of materiality on A1B and A1A. But given the framework of A1A and A1B, I would say that A1A is a higher risk area, since what you're doing is actually furnishing a theoretically, if you've got this problem, you'll have furnished at some point a non-conforming good or service to the federal government. Whereas under A1B, you'll have simply made a certification about your internal operations that it's now taking exception to. Now, granted, that you made that certification in order to induce the government to award or extend a contract, so there's still risk, but the materiality of the statement is, I think, more debatable. So time will tell. I don't think whether the restriction is well tailored to the underlying purpose of the restriction is where the fight's likely to be. And I'll say one other thing on that briefly, because I know you have other questions, and that's Huawei has actually already challenged this restriction. And they challenged it in the Eastern District of Texas, and the courts ruled on the challenge to the restriction itself. And when we fight over these types of requirements in government contracts, one area where we often fight is, well, was the restriction actually tailored to the purpose? But when we're doing that, it's usually under the APA because the restriction appears in a regulation. Huawei didn't have that advantage, if you will. And if you're fighting over the restriction that you're accused of violating and making the argument that it's not well tailored, you really have one less tool in your toolbox, because this isn't a regulatory restriction, it's a statutory restriction. So the only question we have left is, when Congress was making the decision, did they act within their authority? And I think that's going to be difficult for anyone to argue. And the reason I say that is, if you go back and you read this case where Huawei challenges the rule, DOJ, the government, took the position that the rule had sort of 2 purposes. One was a purpose of removing espionage risk from the US supply chain. And the second purpose was choosing not to spend federal dollars on equipment that may create an espionage risk in the US supply chain. And once you're arguing over whether Congress had a legitimate purpose and how it decided to spend federal funds, it's a very, very difficult case to make. And in fact, Huawei lost that case.
Thanks very much, Scott. We had a good discussion with Tom on the CMMCs. I'm going to skip to the next question, which I think goes to the heart of what Gene and Rob were talking about, the issues under the President Trump's initiative to onshore essential medical supplies. I should point out that Phil Hogan, the trade lead for the European Commission, announced that the European Union would not be following a similar strategy of onshoring medical production. So this is an important policy decision on the part of the United States to onshore the production of essential medical supplies. And I have a question for both of you is, why did President Trump announce or call for a revision of the coverage at the back of the government procurement agreement in the annexes? The annexes describe what's covered, and he said we want to revise what the United States agrees to cover in order to allow onshoring. But why not just exercise the exception that Rob and Anna Muller talked about in their article? Why not just exercise the exception in Article 3 for health and security purposes? Wouldn't that be a simpler way of going at this problem?
Gene, I could make a comment. I mean, in a way, Chris, I think you've answered the question. I mean, if all that the administration was trying to do is to defend the U.S. from the pandemic and to take emergency measures to safeguard the U.S. public, it is fully authorized to do that under the GPA. So I think we have to see that this is the current intention seems to be to go beyond that, to actually have to be part of a long run effort at onshoring. And, you know, and for that, I can see actually that I mean, if you really want to do that, then you would have to change the coverage of the GPA. I see the point. Because that goes beyond just emergency measures in the short run context of the pandemic. But is this a good policy? I've indicated that I don't think it is. I think actually future resilience of supply chains and our capacity to counter future pandemics and other medical emergencies will be better served by having a multiplicity of supply possibilities. And, you know, we don't, how can we be confident that we'll always be first to get the right medicines here or the right vaccine here? I don't think we can. I think it's better to partake of all the possibilities that are out there in the world. And that's the kind of trade framework that we should be striving for. You mentioned the Simon Evanet, Alan Winters proposal, and I mentioned the proposal by New Zealand and Singapore, which are very much directed at these problems. They're intended to fill the gap with respect to export restraints, maintain high levels of transparency with respect to procurement in this current pandemic and future pandemics. And I personally, respectfully, think that's a better way to protect US citizens from public health emergencies and to safeguard and to maintain competition in supply chains.
Gene, did you want to weigh in?
Yes, I mean, I don't know the reason they didn't pursue the Article 3 approach, but I don't think that's ever been used. At least it's not been publicly discussed. You know, I'm sure maybe some countries have used it, but I'm not aware of any. So the US may have been concerned about whether its proposal, its treatment of PPEs and other things would fit under that. But I think one of the broader concerns should be or might be is that, you know, the president's often taken actions, you know, whether it's national security claims for the 232 steel, aluminum, et cetera, tariffs. He's often taken actions that, you know, he can point to a statute, but when you start probing it, he really cannot substantiate his activities based upon what the statute requires. So it may be that they realize that all their protectionism approaches or protectionistic approaches might fall short of allowing them to invoke that article.
Very good. So I just want to close out. I have a question regarding Section 889, which we'll address during the informal session in a minute. I just want to close out with Roland and Mikhail on a question on what's going on in Europe under the IPI, the International Procurement Instrument, and the white paper. As Mikhail discussed, the white paper contemplates an exclusion, which is a non-qualification decision of vendors who are proffering items that are subject to a foreign subsidy. The Brandenburg decision that Roland Stein talked about has to do with an exclusion of Chinese vendors because of the foreign content, and the IPI would create a price discriminate on a price basis against nations that have not fairly traded from the Europeans' perspective with the United States. So from the American perspective, for both of you, Mikhail and for Roland, should we see this as a double whammy that potentially the European Union would be both applying exclusion and a price preference against foreigners, against foreign vendors, if the European Union feels as though it hasn't been dealt with fairly?
Did I start? So I think I think at the outset, it's important to know that at least in my humble opinion, the EU procurement market is, I think, extremely open. We don't have buy EU policies, we don't have buy Polish, buy German, buy Irish. So that's you can basically run here for every competition, regardless of whether you come from. So the discussions we are having, they really concern extreme examples where the European Union is thinking about how to react to a situation in which it considers that it is basically the only country which has an extremely open market, and all other markets are either not as open or are even restricting itself. So I think and you see when you read the white paper and the IPI that there is they're struggling with themselves because they don't want to restrict the market. They really want to have it open. And I think that's really a belief that you see in Brussels. So I think they really say, okay, if we really need to exclude people, if we really need to apply penalties, if that's what we need to have a more open public international market, then we'll do that. But I think it's not followed by a willingness to apply protectionist measures.
Yeah.
I'm at the same page as Roland is, so I think that single market approach is open and free competition, and this is what we've got here and what we are trying to promote all over the world. And to be honest, I hope for much better cooperation with other countries, with the US. And there's the question about the new European procurement directives, and I don't think so, because I think that's what public procurement is a tool for achieving other goals. And we've got now the Green New Deal, we've got also the digitalization, the new industry policy for Europe, which is similar with its aims to the previous one. So I don't think so, and I hope there will be no protectionist measures. And we are talking now about the thresholds. We are discussing this, but as Roland said, we are, I think, very open for any competition.
Very good. Thank you, Mikhail. Laurence, any last words from the City of Light?
Well, I'm a little bit less optimistic. I would say that the Europeans have learned some lessons coming from the US, actually. And so they have taken the model of the Buy American Act and as well as the Berry Amendment, and they are trying to implement things that are quite similar. But of course, we hope they will change their mind. But this is also because they are pushed in that direction by the whole world and what's going on. Protectionism is not only coming from the US, actually. You have also other countries around the world in this direction. So I think as procurement specialists, we'll still have a lot to do in that field. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurence. Thank you all for joining us today. We're going to close out the recorded session. We're going to leave this on, so please feel free, if you want to join the informal session in 5 minutes, please feel free to leave everything on. We're just going to come back in 5 minutes without the recording on. We're going to have an informal session to discuss section 889. Thank you all, and thank you to the audience. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris. I'll be back in 5.